it's a good feeling to feel that I know probably more than anyone else in this building about its history and about the way the building developed and the extraordinary people who've been here over the years, going right back to my early training. So it's going to be strange in more or less a week's time when suddenly I don't belong here. And part of me is excited about that because it's going to be, I have to look for something new. I don't want to stop choreographing. I don't want to sit at home and vegetate. And I believe very strongly in mature artists. And I feel I've only recently become mature. So I know I want to go on, and I'm going to find ways of doing that, either here or overseas or wherever. So in that sense, that's very exciting, but it's a very strange pull to be leaving this building, which I've been walking into this building, from more or less the same part of London for 5 decades. I can remember it very clearly. Robin had found this building, Robin Howard, who was the founder of the Contemporary Dance Trust. And he brought me and Sue Siobhan Davis on a rainy afternoon. We'd finished classes at the studios where we were off Oxford Street. And he said, "Have you got a lecture now, or are you free?" And I said, "We're free." And he said, "I want you to see something." And he brought us here. And it was an old drill hall. And the theatre and what is now the bar were all one big hall. It hadn't been used for a long time. It had obviously been hired out for parties, so there were buckets to catch the rain and rather forlorn, deflated balloons in the rafters. But you could see the potential of it. And Robin also, who was a really remarkable man, who had tragically lost his legs. They were blown off on the last day of the Second World War. But he still had a very strong feeling for things military. And so he was thrilled that this building was the home of the artist rifles, so that artists such as Wilfred Owen were in the artist rifles. And that connection meant a lot to Robin. And he brought us in here, and we walked around, and we saw the rifle range where the cafe is now. And when Bob came here, Bob Cohan, who was the first artistic director, he came with all his knowledge from the Martha Graham Company and said, the floors have to be Canadian maple. And then there you are, they had to be. And the sprung floors were laid all through the building. And it was very raw, not really finished when the students first came in, but very, very exciting. New things are very, very exciting. I was always fascinated reading about the early days of Rambert, and I felt that I'd suddenly found a new version of that. And there was a tremendous intensity. Nobody really knew what they were doing, apart from Bob. And it was the most extraordinary time. We were just thinking about it earlier this week because they've produced a book of 50 years of London School of Contemporary Dance. And so we were not being nostalgic, but remembering how exciting it was. Of course it's exciting now, but it's something quite different. It's evolved, it's developed, all sorts of new ideas coming in. But I think in those days, right at the beginning, it was rather wonderful that we didn't know what the hell we were doing, so we were open to anything. At that time, Robin had been completely enthralled by Martha Graham and her dance language and her dance training. And so that was what came here, first of all, in those days, before other things were added and it all became more complicated. When I finished my training here, Robin applied for a grant for me because he thought it would be good if I went to New York. But I said, no, I don't want to go to New York. I have reasons for staying here. And when you're that young, you're very stubborn. So I was given this thing called a Gulbenkian Dance Award. And with it, I formed this small group called Strider. So we danced all over the country in all sorts of strange venues like art galleries and marketplaces and what have you. We were what would nowadays be called site-specific. And we experimented and we had a lot of fun. And then I realized after 3 years that I needed to learn more. My knowledge was superficial. And so that was when I did indeed go to New York. And for 2 years I studied at the Cunningham studio. I had become enthralled by Merce because I found his work, especially at that time. Sue and I went to the south of France in 1970 and saw the company. Really extraordinary dancers. And so I knew I really wanted to go and work with him, to go and study with him. And so going to New York in 1975 was an absolutely extraordinary time. All sorts of things were developing, all sorts of things were changing. The range of dance in that city then was quite phenomenal. There's good things in New York now, but there's not so much money. It's the same all over the world. So the whole system that was very good for supporting dance at all sorts of levels has sort of disintegrated now. And so it's only the kind of brave and tough who managed to keep going, and they're terrific. But at that time, dance was everywhere. I remember thinking when I was crossing a street, meeting a dancer from one of the studios where I took class, and thinking, good heavens, this is a city where to be a dancer is a normal profession. You meet so many dancers and you see them on the subway and you see them working in restaurants, which we all did a lot. And dance was part of the fabric of New York City. And so that people who were dancers were proud of it. I'm not saying that London was ashamed of it, but they just didn't know quite what was going on. It's taken a long time for dance to find a place that is now more welcome than it was at that time. But in New York it was amazing. And the range of work that I could see was extraordinary. So I saw really wonderful performances by Trisha Brown. I cured my homesickness by going to see Ashton ballets done by the Joffrey. I had a very good friend who used to take me up to try and educate me to like New York City Ballet, which I eventually did. Loved it, but not at first. Isn't that weird? But there you are. I saw all sorts of things. I saw the most extraordinary things. And then at a certain point, I realized that I had family to come back to, and I missed my home. And I missed a history that went further back than 1600. Isn't that weird? But I really did. I mean, there wasn't much from 1600, certainly not around New York. It was much more likely the 1700s. And I can remember when I was studying, I made my living by cleaning apartments, which was quite easy to do. You took X amount of hours, you got X amount of dollars, and then you can get on with your life. And once I went to a house, the young couple said with great enthusiasm, "Oh, we're so lucky to live in such an old house. We love it. It's 1888, you know." And I thought, oh, for heaven's sake. So I came back here. I came back here for my own culture and for my family. And I had learned a lot. I'd worked really, really hard when I was there. And so I'd learned a great deal. When I came back, I taught like a maniac. There was nobody, it's very hard to imagine now, but there was nobody in this country teaching Cunningham technique. And I had to run from pillar to post, teaching all over the place. But I loved it. It was great. It's a beautiful studio. It still is. Now the Martha Graham Company lives and works there. It's the whole top floor of a building, so it's a very large space with a whole wall of windows either side. So it's light and spacious. There could easily be 50 people in class without it feeling crowded. Merce used to kind of pad quietly out of his office at the back, which was covered, all concealed with potted plants, which he nourished and nurtured. He'd come through his plants and he'd pad along down the side of the space and then go to the middle. His classes were absolutely packed. He had such a charisma that everybody worked so hard. We were all dripping with sweat. We worked hard in the other classes, but we didn't tremble quite so much as we did in Merce's classes. And Merce, meanwhile, would give these extraordinary phrases. He gave the same warm-up every day, which was fine. That meant we could get familiar with it. then he would give us these very complicated phrases. And only when we'd come across the floor, probably felt like about 15 times, would he then stop people and tell people what it was that they hadn't quite understood, and then he moved on. He didn't give you the chance to do it again. It was quite a Zen way of teaching, but it was extraordinary. And he was a really extraordinary, very, very quiet, understated, but extraordinary teacher, and an extraordinary man to have known. Supremely comfortable after Graham. Graham was very hard for me to do. I love the Graham language, and it still influences me because the sensations in the Graham technique are very strong, and I can still feel them. But I couldn't, you're supposed to sit in what is called a second position on the floor. I kind of sat behind my legs. I couldn't get my pelvis up on the top. I didn't have the facility. So it was painful and it was hard, and I knew that I wasn't very good at it. Didn't mean I didn't love it, but I was struggling. And a remarkable teacher arrived called Viola Faber, a really wonderful, wonderful dancer. She came to London and she taught classes, and she said, "All right, you don't have to sit on the floor." I start standing up. And it was like opening a door. It was like opening a door to a great sunlit space, because suddenly I could move without the kind of inadequacy and agony that I had suffered. So Merce's work really suited me. Merce has a long body. I have a long body. He changed things from the Graham work because it hurt his back. And he invented new ways, very much connected to both classical ballet and Graham. So it's a very logical technique, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. The simple answer is that Robin was an extraordinary man of great vision, but because he had, as it were, a damaged physique, he did not have legs, he knew that what to a normal person, to a complete person, would just be a cold, would be a very serious virus for him. And so he did not expect to live as long as he actually did. The reason why I'm telling you that is because at one point we had a talk. We had often talked together. He was wonderful to me. And we had a talk, and I said to him, "Robin, I don't understand why you're in such a rush. Everything's just starting. It takes time for things to evolve, and suddenly you want to be touring and you want to be doing this." And that's when he said to me, "Well, that's because I really don't know whether I'll be here next week, Richard. So I need to establish something that will survive. And so I therefore have to vindicate what we're doing with the establishment." And to that extent, he very cleverly encouraged the support of Ninette de Valois and Rambert. Rambert was very encouraging to him, Madame Rambert. So he said, so when we're touring, we need to reach an audience, and we need to look for a sort of middle-of-the-road audience, because we need to actually financially survive. I guess I was 20 or something, and I was very honest with him and said, well, as an artist just starting out, and as a young man of 20, I don't really want to reach a middle-of-the-road audience. I want to do all sorts of things. I don't know what it is I want to do, but it's not that. So I think I'm going to find a way of getting a small group of people, like-minded, and we'll become independent and we'll leave the place. Robin was wonderful about it. He was obviously disappointed in certain ways. He seemed to think that I would have a future here. But he also said to Robert Cohan, the artistic director, he said, well, the first person who we believe in is leaving, and that's a huge step forward for us. We've nurtured someone, and now they're moving on. It's like having a family, and the offspring are leaving, and we should be slightly disappointed, but also very, very glad. So he was wonderfully supportive. And with Strider, we did all sorts of things. It was a very exciting time. Looking back, I would say we didn't really know what we were doing, and luckily the Arts Council didn't check up that much in those days. But we did all sorts of interesting things, and we got to a point where we really knew that we needed to actually bolster our knowledge. We needed to have more knowledge, and that's why I went to, not only I, but also another dancer too. We both went to New York. I'd been teaching a lot. I had put on performances at Riverside Studios, which was a wonderful space. I had become very good friends with Val Bourne, and we, for instance, were in the first night of the first Dance Umbrella Festival. And Val started thinking about whether Dance Umbrella could evolve into some kind of management, and I was one of the artists she asked if I would be interested. So she sent someone to talk to me about what I would need from a management and what I dreamt of. And I spoke to this person and I said, well, I'd really like a group of dancers that I can work with consistently. I'm very, very interested in trying to have live music. And these are really major things. And so the answer from this advisor was, well, you better join someone like Rambert then, hadn't you? Because it's not going to happen. And this was in 1980. And I was astonished. And it happened that at that more or less the same moment, Christopher Bruce and John Chesworth from Rambert had come to Riverside, and they got me in the bar and said, would you come and make a work for Rambert? So I did in 1979, and amongst the dancers was this very tall, very young Michael Clark. That's the first time we worked together. And in the course of making the work, it seemed to be there was a period of transition going on because Christopher had left by the time I was there. And some of the dancers said, we really like doing this, working with you. Couldn't you be here more permanently? Because Christopher's gone, so we don't have anyone creative in the company, and that's been what Rambert has always been about. And that's how this offer came through to be a resident choreographer. And I chose it because not only were the dancers really interesting because they had a lot of classical training in their background, and I was very intrigued to explore that, but also they had this wonderful music ensemble. And I thought, oh, I'll have some of that, please. There was the Mercury Ensemble. It was about 16 more musicians, and it meant that from then on I could really begin to work with live music. And that was a hugely attractive thing to me. I had a wonderful music director there. He called himself Nicholas Carr in those days, and then he came here to the place and was music director for London Contemporary in its last era. And he changed his name to, I think, his mother's name, Nicholas Moshenko. He was Russian in origin. And he was fantastic. He was really wonderfully supportive. And if you had an idea for a dance, he would know what sort of contemporary music would be an exciting possibility. And having said that, he also was the one who arranged the Andean folk music so that live musicians could play it here for Christopher Bruce's ghost dances. So he had a wide range of interests and was passionate about music. So music was always a part of my choices of when I was going to make a dance. And in those days, of course, there was quite a strict musicians' union, so you couldn't use whatever you wanted. You had to, if there was music that could be played live, it had to be played live. I didn't mind that. I found that, necessity is the mother of invention, and so I found it really interesting to keep looking for music and to meet composers. And I also developed relationships with the really marvelous marketing people who were trying to sell the work of young composers at Boosey and Hawkes, at Universal Edition, at the different publishing houses. So I got to meet a lot of composers. And, it was nothing but a pleasure, it was nothing but a pleasure to be working with live music. And I began to learn how particularly concerned I was with phrasing, and how I saw that music, if you phrased dance, not the same way as music, but if you phrased it in a way that understood music, that breathed with the music, you could make quite complicated things and people could see it and understand it because they were listening and watching at the same time. So I felt music was a real friend, and it stayed that way until now, forever. It's a long learning curve. I know which pieces are special to me. I can look back now and say, oh, that was an interesting moment, and that really meant that. And the work recently, I feel I now know what it is I'm trying to do, and so I can push it further. But it was all a great way of learning, and I did not, and still do not, expect them all to be around forever by any means. There certainly were pieces from my time with Rambert. One of them was Wildlife, which had a score by Nigel Osborne, and wonderful set by Richard Smith, marvellous artist who did these kites. He did them very often for large gallery spaces, but he did these for the stage so they could move. And the music was based on all sorts of cultures all around the world. And it elicited quite a new movement language from me. So I've always thought that piece was very important to me. The pieces I made for Michael Clarke were very special because he was very special. So I made a piece called Rainbow Ripples, where he was one of the leading dancers, and we still, Kate Price, who was in Rambert at the time, now teaches here in the school here, so she teaches that in repertory class. And other pieces, I made a piece called Rough Cut, 2 Steve Reich pieces for clarinet and for guitar. We've done that a lot, it's still done. And one of the marvellous things about that was that we got to do that in the Paris Opera. At the time of the war, the Gulf War, suddenly the Martha Graham Company said they couldn't fly across the Atlantic because they thought it was too high risk. So they wouldn't come to an engagement at the Paris Opera. And we were touring in France at the time, way down in the south of France, near Biarritz. And I got this telephone call in the hotel. Someone saying, I wonder if you could possibly help us. We need someone to fill these dates. They've sold out houses for 4 performances by the Martha Graham Company. And I tried not to kind of shriek. I said, oh, well, of course I'll have to think about it, and we'll do our best to help you. I will ring you later. Then I jumped into the street and stood screaming. I was so excited. So we went there and we did Rough Cut there on this enormous stage. And with Rough Cut, we opened the space out totally. We never had wings or anything. And they had this 60-foot cyclorama at the back of the stage. The stage was so huge. And we have a video of it, which I love, where you see these tiny figures flying around. So there were always very special performances, wonderful performances travelling abroad with Rambert in particular. They asked me. They asked me. I wasn't quite certain what I was going to do after Rambert. And so I thought to myself, all right, well, the best thing to do is to, when the telephone goes, say yes. Because I'd very much concentrated on working with Rambert. So that's how I got to work with Shobana Jayasingh. I got to work in Turkey with a company there. And then when I was in Turkey, they rang me and said, would you come and be artistic director of the place, and would you turn what is London Contemporary Dance Theatre into your own company? And so I came back and talked to them, and it seemed like they really wanted me, so I said yes. Well, I can remember in the first week that I was here, working in the studio on a duet which was going well, and thinking I'd really like to push a bit further with this and get to the end of the duet. And it's suddenly dawning on me that there was no one else waiting outside, that this was my company. Because one of the joys of Rambert, but also one of the pressures, was the joy was looking after other choreographers' work. The pressure was that then very often, especially as artistic director, you gave yourself the last slot in the day, you let them have the best dancers, etc., etc. So when I went into the studio next door, we're in a room right next door to what's been my studio for 25 years, I thought, I'm not keeping anyone waiting. I could work all day on this. And it was the most wonderful freedom. And when I started, I gave myself time to make something and then maybe throw it completely out and start again. And because I had that time, I never did. It somehow liberated something in me. I had a wonderful time at Rambert, but it became very tiring. Dealing with all the fundraising, dealing with all the other sides of an institution with a long history. I was fascinated by it. I loved the history. I once went there to a gathering for someone who was leaving a couple of years after I'd left, and I walked into the room where they were having the party, and I looked round and I thought, you know, it's probably a fact that I know more people in this room than any other human being, because I knew dancers right back to the beginning because I'd been really interested in them, and we had revived early Ashton pieces, and I'd asked advice. We did Tudors, Dark Elegies, and I had a very strong sense of the company's history. And then I had known the Rambert that I first saw at the Janetta Cochrane in '66 and after that. And then I joined in 1980, and so I'd known all the dancers after that. So I felt I was very much part of the family there. But having said that, I've never lost that sense. But I was a guest in the family, if you like, and here this is my family. This building is my family, is my home. So that was a very, very nice thing about being asked to come back.